Hello and welcome back to our podcast, What Now? On the Threshold of Life, Death, and Grief. It's great, as always, to be back in the studio, and I'm here with my friends and colleagues.
Red Keating, Dave Kennedy.
And I'm Julie Brown. And we have another guest with us today, Sheila Bourgeois. Thanks for joining us today, Sheila.
It's great to be here.
I just want to take a moment just to formally introduce Sheila. So Sheila holds a Master's of Science degree in Child Life and Pediatric Psychosocial Care from McMaster University, and she's a certified child life specialist. She has an extensive background in family support through working with organizations such as the Mayo Clinic, Hospital for Sick Children, and Peterborough Child and Family Services. Right now, she's currently employed at Hospice Peterborough as their family and child life specialist, and we're very lucky to have her working with our organization and in our community. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
So Sheila, it is a delight to have you because of your expertise too in this particular area that I don't think gets addressed nearly enough. So thank you for sharing this time. And perhaps we could just begin by asking you when we think about grief, perhaps just help us understand what are the things that might be different about children experiencing that grief versus adults experiencing grief.
Yeah, and as adults, we actually could learn quite a bit from kids. Kids are really good at touching on their grief and then going back to what feels normal. So they may say, Grandma died. They might shed some tears, and then they might go back to building their Lego and then come back a little while later and repeat, Grandma's dead, and then go back to playing. And sometimes adults may misconstrue that means that they don't understand what's happened or they aren't grieving properly, but they're actually just really good at breaking it into smaller chunks, which is something as adults, if we could break it into smaller chunks, that would be amazing. But kids are really good at doing that. The other visual that's sometimes used around children's grief is puddle jumping. They'll jump in a puddle and then they'll go back to playing and then jump in another puddle.
So what's that about? Why do they do that?
So part of it is just as they process the information, coming back and reinforcing the same information over and over again that Grandma has died, and they'll come back to it just to really solidify it in their mind. And it's also just about touching on things that are really difficult and then backing away and seeking comfort in something that feels normal. And I think they just do that naturally, which is really beautiful when you can recognize what's happening.
What stands out there for me is, as someone who does a lot of trauma work with clients, we often talk about titrating trauma, right? We don't go into it all at once. We go into it slowly. And it sounds like children have the capacity to titrate grief for themselves. They do a little bit and then they exit. They do something that maybe feels soothing, a quote, normal. And then, as you say, they move back into it.
Yeah, they're able to sort of go back to that comfort of what they know, the play, and then touch on the pieces and go back and forth, which, is really amazing to watch kids when they're grieving.
I think that's really important for the adults to know, because I can remember working with a family and the dad would keep getting mad at the kids because they were laughing and playing. And it was like, he'd go like, don't you realize my father just died? And it wasn't your grandfather. It was like my father. And he would get mad at them.
Yeah.
Right. And we had to have conversations like that to say, but that's normal. Mm-hmm. And understanding how children grieve differently helped him realize that his kids weren't being inconsiderate. Right. That's what he thought.
Yeah.
He thought that they didn't have the consideration to feel the weight of what just happened to the family. Right.
Yeah.
And so I think that's incredibly important.
Well, and I think something else that often happens in families is adults will not want to cry or not want to show the range of emotions they're experiencing when they're grieving in an attempt to protect the child from those really big feelings. But kids are watching us and they learn from what we're doing. And so when we're not showing our emotions, kids learn that in these situations, it's not safe to show feelings. Whereas when a parent cries and says, I'm really missing my mom or my dad in that example, it's teaching kids that it's okay to show sad feelings. It's okay to let others know when you're struggling. So it's actually really important that kids see our emotional processing after we've experienced a death.
I think you used a real important word there, that parents, and I understand why we do that as parents, trying to protect those kids. But I often say to parents, we need to change that P word from protecting them to preparing them, and trying to prepare them for what is happening and what is coming, particularly when we're dealing with the palliative side too. But that protection, as a parent, we try. That's kind of our default, right? And yet we don't realize how much long-term impact that can have on a child.
Yeah. And I think even in preparing or protecting a child, there can be a sense of keeping information being helpful, and needing to know all the answers, like being afraid of, if I start to tell them about this cancer diagnosis, I'm not going to be able to answer all the questions, but that's okay. Giving them a little bit of information, kids will come back with the questions that they want more information about, or accept a simple explanation and then go away. If the child does come back and say, what about this? And the caregiver doesn't have an answer, it's okay to say, I don't know. I can help you get an answer to this, or there isn't an answer. When we're talking about death and illness, sometimes there aren't black and white answers. And so saying, let's wonder about, what do we think happens after somebody dies? And let's talk about what we think that looks like. So wondering is okay.
Can I ask a question in terms of when does a child come to understand death, in that sense of that
finality?
The finality of it.
Right.
Thanks, Rad. When does that take place in child development?
So usually later school age is the point where kids generally have a full understanding of death. There's lots of different pieces that they may understand along the way, such as death means that all of our body's functions stop. We don't breathe anymore. Our body doesn't get hungry. And then understanding that it's final, that somebody who's died can't become alive again, is a separate piece. And so it's usually around that later school age, 10 to 12, where kids have a fairly full understanding of what death is, and that it's permanent and means that all functions have stopped.
When you talk about that puddle jumping with children, are we what age are we talking? Because I've seen that in adolescents as well. So what's the range that you're thinking of in terms of how grief is manifesting in that way?
So younger kids are really good at just touching on it and coming back to it. As kids' brains develop and they understand the complexities of loss and human relationships, they may feel some guilt associated with doing things that are comforting, because you're supposed to feel sad all the time after someone's died. And so they may start to struggle with some of those concepts of, it's okay to live. It's actually really important to do things that you enjoy. So the puddle jumping is most obvious with younger kids. And then as kids' brains grow, they may start to withhold some of the feelings, or kids will often be afraid to ask questions because they're worried if they ask questions that it'll make things happen, which is kind of it's a magical thinking piece where kids believe that their actions control the environment around them. And so kids may believe that they caused a death. It's actually not that uncommon for kids to believe that because I had a fight, or because I didn't do my homework, or I didn't eat my fruit and I threw it out at school, that made grandpa die, or that made dad die, because it happened in a close timeline. So just being aware that kids' imaginations can really present a challenge if they don't have appropriate information.
How would you go about kind of detecting, like doing some detective work around that, because kids don't always offer that kind of information, do they?
No. And if there are people who are supporting kids who are grieving, there's a great website called kidsgrief.ca that gives some things just to be considering and watching out for. Sometimes you'll see it show up in their play. And so if all of a sudden you notice that there's patterns in their play around death and what causes the death, that can sometimes tell you what they're thinking. And the other thing is just checking in. Again, I think when we're protecting kids, we worry about asking them about things that may be worries or scary for them. And so we don't ask the questions for fear of planting the seed. But it's actually really important to just check in and say, have you ever wondered whether you might have done something to cause the death? And the kid may say, no. Okay, very good. Or they might say, well, we did have a fight right before. And so that might be a chance to say, okay, well, you know that you did nothing that caused this death, and to clarify that for the child.
And I'm imagining that probably providing some facts might be important with something like that, depending on the age.
Yep, definitely.
Like, they died of cancer, and here's what cancer means. And
yeah, thanks, Julie. Because sometimes, again, in softening the information, people will refer to things like cancer as illness, or someone was sick and they died. And that can be really scary for kids, because we all get sick, especially in this day and age. There's lots of illnesses going around. And if we don't use the proper terms around an illness or diagnosis, kids can sometimes worry that that means that if they catch a cold, that they too might die. Right. Yeah.
So you're just hitting on something that I was thinking about, language being so important, but the age range is so wide, you know?
Yeah.
So is there a difference in using the language you would use with a younger kid, 4 or 5, than maybe someone who is 10?
You might add some information. It might be a longer explanation. For example, if we were talking about a cancer diagnosis, there might be extra information you would add for a 10-year-old, but just keeping it very simple with young kids can be and again, keeping it simple and then letting them ask questions, because they'll help to fill in the gaps that they need filled, because it'll vary from child to child.
I think that's it's really important to be able to provide that specific answer to a question like why did you get cancer? So what causes cancer? And of course, we don't have all those answers either, but I think finding help in an explanation that, well, cancer is when a cell divides in a way it's not supposed to, or however you can find a way to explain that, so that the child doesn't leave fearful that it's something that they're going to catch.
Yeah. Yeah. And kids do worry not only about catching the illness from the person, but other people catching it. So it can be really helpful to clarify that this isn't the kind of thing that's contagious like a cold. This is some cells in someone's body that were doing what they weren't supposed to, and they grew together as a tumor, or they moved around their body if it's a leukemia diagnosis. So there are some different ways to describe it, and some really great resources available on the internet if you are struggling with language.
I might be misremembering this, but do we talk about, is it the 4 C's? Is that what we talk about?
Yeah. So catching, which we've talked about, caring. So they're going to want to know who's going to care for them when other people around them are struggling, because kids don't grieve in isolation. It's often the family unit that's grieving. And so making sure they understand who's going to be picking them up from school, who's going to be helping with dinner when their caregivers aren't available. Catch, care, cure. Kids will often believe, if I'm good enough, if I do everything right, then maybe I'll cure this illness in my person, or maybe I'll bring them back from being dead. So helping them to understand that their actions don't affect death or illness. I'm just trying to think of what the others.
You didn't
cause. Yeah. So we talked about that a little bit earlier, that their actions don't. And then there's actually a 5th C that they talk about, and it's that ongoing connection. So whether somebody's ill or whether they've died, that connection to their special person is an important piece in them navigating the challenging days. And so nurturing that connection. So having items, if someone's died, items that they can hold on to, tangible things that they can touch to feel close to that person. Pictures of special memories. If a loved one is ill and in the hospital, allowing them to draw pictures that can go up in the hospital room, or have FaceTime visits with a person. Just ways that they can show they maintain that connection.
If we come back to the grief piece, I'm just thinking that there's a great opportunity for parents in the teaching and education of that. I'm thinking particularly of pets. So, often kids have pets that die, and parents, I think, miss an opportunity to really explore the grief side of that. And we're so quick to make the child feel better that often we go out and try and find a replacement and just kind of get over it. But I think it could be an important learning opportunity to really feel and understand that grief and to work with that piece around our pets.
Yeah, it's actually, I recently had a conversation with somebody who was talking about a beloved pet that had died a couple years previously, and now they were dealing with the death of a family member. And I said, what a gift that pet has given you, that the kids have a context for right now. It hurts and it's really hard, but it's not always going to feel this hard or this difficult. So lovely that pet continues to give them that. Yeah.
I think it's so important. I'm thinking, if I'm a parent and I'm listening to this podcast and I'm thinking I'm in one of these situations, I love your practicality, like the practical things that you can do. I'm thinking of, we're talking about creating that space, so the kid does feel free to ask those questions, does feel free to go and play and then come back and touch, safe home base, right? What happens when the dynamic isn't that? Like, I'm thinking about, I'm a parent and this is scaring the life out of me to have these conversations, and I don't know how. But what's the dynamic if I don't? What's the message to the child then if I'm in that environment and everybody around me is anxious but nobody's talking? So because I'm trying to get at what's the importance of this for the child, right?
Yeah, and I think going back to, we're modeling for our kids, and so the message in being afraid or not talking is that we don't talk when things are hard. And so opening the dialogue or opening the window and not trying to think that what's going to happen once that door opens, just checking in and offering an opportunity to talk about it really sets up those open communication times when a kid's a teenager and they've done something wrong and they're not really sure. They learn that by having conversations as a family, we can work through this.
Right.
And then the other thing I want to just acknowledge in that piece is that there are times, I talked about how kids don't grieve in isolation. There's a time where the primary caregivers may be overwhelmed by their own grief and not able to support their child or be as present emotionally for them as they would like to be. And if there is another close family member who can step in to offer some support while that parent is getting their feet back on the ground, engaging your support system to help support the child and not feeling like you have to do it on your own. Yes, your child needs you, but it's also okay if you need to engage some other help while you're getting your feet back underneath you.
Right.
I really think, following up, Brad, I really think those early death experiences that we have as children stay with us.
Yep.
They impact our ability to deal with that as an adult and later on. So I think those early childhood death experiences are so important for us to pay attention to. But I don't think that's always been the case. I mean, it's certainly, it hasn't been that long ago when it was said, well, children are resilient and they don't grieve, so just don't worry about them. And I think we miss that chance of recognition of the long-term impact of how that experience is dealt with.
Well, and you think back when we were more farming, when we were more agricultural and rural,
right.
Animals on the farm died all the time, and wakes happened in the parlor, right. And so kids were raised in an environment where death was a very natural, normal thing every day. And I think back to what you were saying there, Sheila, is that if kids are usually involved and included in all the really important things that happen in a family, births, birthdays, anniversaries, holidays, sometimes they're central to the event. And when it comes to death, which is another significant family event and occurrence, if they're not included, right? If they're not brought in, what's the message to them about death? And as we get older, then I just said those young experiences with death set the tone for how we'll cope as adults.
Well, I'm thinking about how often I've seen this show up in my practice, where when somebody is, really struggling, or they're apologizing for crying, or they see that as weakness, or they're being really negative about how they think, quote, that they should be handling grief or a hard experience. And when I start asking them about messages, like, about being with big emotions, or why do we have to apologize for crying, that's where the roots are back there in those early experiences. And so when we model that, I can cry as your mom and still be okay, and you'll see me, you'll see me move into it, and you'll also see me move out of it, then I am really modeling, like, tears are part of our life, just like, our joyous and our happy and our times of laughter. And so it's important for us, to not just say it's okay to be sad about this, but to also show, like, it's really okay to be sad, and also it doesn't last forever, right? Mm-hmm. So that we see that that fluidity of emotions, and I think that's very reassuring for children.
Well, I'm just thinking of, growing up and hearing that phrase, if you're going to cry, go somewhere by yourself. Nobody else wants to see you do that, right? So, that message of, you're right, Julie, of having, not being honest about our emotions and feelings, and the shame that comes with
Mm-hmm.
that, really does stick with us. I was wondering, Sheila, about how you see kids being involved in the rituals around death. So when we have funeral celebrations of life, how important is it for children to have some part in that piece?
Yeah. So the most important thing when it comes to funerals and rituals is giving kids choice. And some kids will want to be involved. Some kids may want to create a piece of artwork to have present. Some kids might want to speak. And some kids may not feel comfortable being there. And it's okay if they say, no, that feels too big to me and I want to stay home that day, and finding a family friend who can be there with them, but giving them choices around what it looks like. We always want to do it right? Like, we don't want to make the wrong call. But that doesn't need to be on the adults. Letting the kids have choices around what the right call is so important. We sometimes at hospice, after there's been a death and the body is there may be opportunities for family members to spend some time with the person's body. And families have said, I don't think it's appropriate to ask if the kids want to be there. And I'll just encourage them to ask the kids. And I've seen family members where there's siblings who do want to spend time with their family member, and there's kids who don't want to. And both answers are right, because the kids have had a say in what their needs are in that moment. And there can be really beautiful things that happen. Kids have crawled into bed with their family member and had one last snuggle. And it's an opportunity that the child has been able to do what feels right to them. And so hopefully in the process, that's exactly what they needed in that moment.
It seems to me that that what I've heard throughout this, I keep in my mind, I keep thinking, it's our, as adults, we're uncomfortable with our own dying and death, and we just impose that on our kids. I think we have to deal with our own issues around death and dying if we're going to be good parents around around that.
Well, and you talked about, when we were talking about the dog, you talked about fixing it. Like we live in this culture where everything needs to be fixed so that we can feel better. And in the same way that it's a challenge for us to be present with our own grief and intense feelings, kids need to have the space to experience those feelings as well. I've spoken to parents of teenagers who have said, you know, I try and comfort them. I want to hug them. I want to be with them when they're crying. But the teenager is like, no, what I need is to be left alone so I can just release my tears. And this is part of what I need to do. And so I had to say to the parent, whose need is the comforting? Because the child needs the space to cry and process their feelings. And it's your own need to comfort your child, which I understand, but recognizing that what the child's need is, what the teenager's need is in this moment, is to just have some time to cry and not be touched and not be checked in with constantly.
I feel like what we're talking about here is attunement.
Yeah.
Is parental attunement here is, and I often teach this to people and say, you know, think of the tuning of a dial, or the old dials on radios when we used to do that, right? Where you're tuning in to try to find just the right kind of clarity of the radio station. And that's what we want to do to with our children, right? We want to tune in. And so when you're saying you're offering them choice, you're checking in with them. Yeah, you seem sad. Would you like me to sit with you, or do you need some space right now? Okay, well, you need some space. Okay, so you know that I'll just be down in the kitchen. I'm here for you, right? So it's that tuning in, and as you say, there's no right way. It's checking in, the tuning in, and respecting that, you know, there's temperament here at play too, right? That children will want and need different things at different times, and we don't know the right way unless we check in with them.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing I think about teenagers is often their support system are their friends, and I think sometimes parents, you know, feel neglected and my child isn't talking to me. They're not, but and so what they say is my child isn't talking about this, when in fact they probably are amongst their friends in a way that the parent isn't aware of. And you know, I think teenagers, that's their peer piece is a real important part of their journey in that.
Yeah. And that's a natural part of development, that they will lean heavily on their peers, which I think is an important piece for friends' parents to recognize, that you may need to check in if your child has a friend who has experienced a death, checking in with your own child who may be offering some pretty important support to their friend, and just making sure that they're as supported as possible as well.
I've found on that note, sometimes the challenge there though is when you are relying on your friend group as a teenager, and say it's been a really significant loss, like the loss of a parent, and your social group we struggle with that as adults, right? Mm-hmm. If we haven't kind of really known loss. I've seen teenagers, teens in that situation almost end up suppressing their grief just to kind of try to be, you know, normal, because there's not a lot of space for that, because nobody really knows what to do with it.
No. And there is such beauty when teens are willing to do some group work, to have teens who are both experiencing grief and figuring out how to navigate it, connect and realize that they're not alone, because it is a very isolating experience, especially when it's the death of a parent or a sibling. So to see them connect and recognize they're not alone is a really cool thing to
I
see.
Agree. I guess I was thinking of a particular situation where this 19-year-old was killed in a car accident. He was driving, and they lived in a small community, and so everybody knew everybody, and there was a large group of that peer support. And I had a number of parents that I was working with, along with the parents whose son had died. But many of them had said that to me. You know, my child doesn't seem to be talking. But that group, so where it's a peer death, I think that support there is really strong. And yet I think they too need to be checked in on.
Yes.
I remember doing some work with them, outside of, in a very informal way, but the importance of just listening and talking.
Mm-hmm.
And can you speak to how sometimes some of that grief work occurs much later?
Yeah.
It has been my experience that they've done the amount of processing. It doesn't mean that they avoided it necessarily, but they can only kind of, I find, do so much, kind of depending on developmental stage.
Yep.
And then sometimes we're doing that grief work much further on. Can you comment on that?
And so what happens with kids is as their brains develop and they understand the world differently, they will revisit the loss. And so they may come back to it a year, 2 years, 5 years down the road and need to do some additional work or check in and ask for information. And parents, a red flag may go up and they think, oh shoot, they haven't had an opportunity to grieve properly. That's a normal part of the grieving process with kids. And yes, they might need a little extra support as they're navigating that. But it's to be expected that they will revisit it at later stages of development because they're understanding the world differently.
Yeah.
Plus the life situations. I remember, situations where a mother died when a daughter was young, and everything seemed to be fine. They did the grief work through the teen years, and then when that adult now was getting married, and all of a sudden the wedding, and her mother's not there to look after that, it all came flooded back. So it's those life moments too that can bring that all back, and that can go on forever, right? The other thing I wanted to ask you, Sheila, was what do we do with children around a traumatic death? So let's talk about if the death was a suicide, or a particularly violent death, even a drug overdose or whatever. How do we, in a younger child, so we're talking, let's say, 8 and under, how much do we convey to them around the death itself?
So it can be really helpful for kids to have appropriate information and language such as our family member died by suicide, and talking about what may have impacted that around mental health, or if there was substance use, talking about what may have led up to the death and giving appropriate information, because sometimes families will want to share a different story with a child, but there are other people who know in the family. And so it can come back around to the child and they may be afraid to say, I actually know, I've heard these words being used at school, or I've heard these words being used at Thanksgiving, at holidays when there's family gatherings. And so giving them that language can actually be helpful in the long run, even though it can feel really hard in the moment. That being said, sometimes parents have already given different information and say, okay, but now I want to come back and recognize that this was a death by suicide or this was a death by overdose. And so going back to the child and saying, I made a choice a couple years ago when the death happened, to not share that because I didn't feel you were ready for the information then. But I think it's really important that you know the whole picture and you have all the information now. So it is okay to go back and say, I made choices for a reason at that point. Let's talk about what really happened. And I'm going to give you some different language and information now.
Family secrets rarely remain secrets.
No. Yeah. And kids often hear a lot that the adults might not be aware that they're hearing. And with little pieces of information, they will do an amazing job of filling in the gaps with their imagination.
And I think that when they hear it like that, sometimes we've now had a traumatic loss and there's another layer of trauma there can be when people find out through those ways, or, I've had clients where, they're in a social gathering or they find out and they just feel like they've run into a wall. Like they just feel hit by it. And that can be very disorienting for someone. So.
Sorry, I know we do want to talk a little bit about the coming holiday season, but I just had a question before we go there, or a thought. Of course, you guys are all talking and my head's drifting in 16 different directions because I was thinking, what I'm hearing is a whole lot of inclusion at the age appropriate language and using appropriate language. And I was thinking about, I remember years and years and years ago, there was a mother dying and she had 2 little boys, and the dad was just distraught, and the family didn't know what to do, and they didn't know how to include the kids. And we had several conversations, and he was ready to sort of sit down with his kids and tell them what was actually happening. And we got to that point, and we were in the room, and the doctor was there, and I was there, and the children were there, and he was there, and there was, I don't know who was supporting him, but there was another adult or 2 in the room. And he looked at me, and he just said, he just shook his head, and he says, "I can't do it." And I looked at him with these questioning eyes, and he pointed at me, he says, "Can you do it?" And I went, "Well, okay." And so they're looking at these little kids with big eyes. They know something's up, right? And so I just started to talk in a way that we had discussed with, and I didn't get too far into it. And of course, the little kids are like deers in the headlights. And then I come to the word dying and cancer. And they looked up at their dad and they saw him crying, and they got up off the floor, and because they were sitting on the floor, and they sat beside him and sort of put their arms around him. And the 3 of them just melded together as one. And I thought, that's what they've been missing. They've not only been missing the comfort of their father, they've been missing the opportunity to comfort. And not that we should ever put that expectation on children to be our comforters, but it was just wonderful to watch. And then it just became so natural that then myself, after a while, and the doctor were just sort of able to back out of the room and give them that time as a family. And so I was sitting here thinking, like I said, I don't want to say children should be our comforter, but that's a role that they play. And if I'm an adult and I'm sitting there and I'm tearful and I'm watching television and my kid sees that, if it's okay, if we've created the space for that to be okay, then they get to climb up on the couch and sit beside me and maybe not say anything, but just be with me, recognizing that I'm sad. Mm-hmm. And so by not including them, we're not supporting them to feel safe in the grief. We're also not giving them the opportunity to then comfort.
I'm wondering, before we wrap up, I know you do a lot of work with arts, the creative arts, and as a form of expression. And I know you also do some of it in terms of honoring the continuing bonds. Mm-hmm. And I just wanted to give you an opportunity just to speak about some of that and what some of us could be doing at home around that.
So it's really lovely. Kids don't sit and talk about big things and stay in a conversation for a long period of time. Their natural way of engaging with the world is having some play or something that they can do. So whether it's having some drawing sheets out or coloring sheets out while you're talking to a child, or engaging them in creating items that help them to maintain that connection. So, something that symbolizes the special memories that they have with their person. There are some doing paintings that show a special memory that can be in the room. One of the things that we've recently started doing more at hospice is making prayer flags that allow comfort to be present in a space. And so kids will just take little pieces, cardboard squares, and draw pictures of special memories or qualities that they really love about their person who's died, and then they'll hang them up in their room. And they're really beautiful, and it's something simple you could do with some yarn and cardboard, but it allows that honoring and recognition of the person in their life to be present in the space, that physical piece.
Lovely.
Mm-hmm. So as we kind of finish up here, we did a whole podcast dedicated to the holidays and unwrapping the holidays and the challenges around that, both for grief and for palliative situations. And perhaps you could just, as we finish here, talk a little bit about what practical things might be helpful at this time of the year if we're dealing with grief or we're dealing with a family where it might be the last Christmas, mm-hmm. where someone significant is. What kinds of things do you see would be significant to focus on with children?
So I'm going to come back to something I've already said, which is giving some choices. What's really important to our family at the holidays? And do we want to keep these things the same this year, or do we want to do them a little bit differently? If we're missing somebody who's died over the past year, do we want to still set a place for them at the table? Do we want to light a candle to recognize that there is this void. There's somebody missing this year at our holiday traditions, and we're still thinking about them, and they're still very present in our hearts. So let's have something physical to recognize how present they still are and will continue to be in our lives. But asking kids, which are the important pieces to you, and which do we hold on to, and which do we let go of?
I think we were talking before we started recording, and you were talking about that in a way, and of course someone's going to have to remind me what it is. I had it in my head and now it's gone, but that sense of what happens at special occasions, and a significant person is not here for the first time and nobody talks about them. Like they don't set a place.
Yeah.
What can you sort of go through that little story again, because I think that was really powerful.
So there was a young boy who came in and was talking about how he had recently gone through a special family event that the family gathered for each year. And he was highly aware that everybody was not talking about his dad who had died. They were avoiding anything that would remind. And he said, I just kept thinking, like, my dad would be here. He's a part of this every year. And so he said, I thought about it the whole time, and nobody else was acknowledging it. And I understand why they were doing that, but it just made it harder because he was supposed to be there. And so we talked about how having a candle or having a picture of dad to just sort of say, we're all thinking about dad, and dad is still a part of what we feel here, even though he's not physically present with us anymore.
And I think that is such a powerful story, because I've heard similar stories when a parent has had a child die and there's a significant event happening and the guests come and everybody's chatting and nobody mentions the name or says anything about the child that has died. And the parents have been truly hurt by that,
It's
you know,
profoundly painful.
And just it sticks with them. And it was interesting when you told that story to hear, wow, kids, they're not that far. You know, they exactly have the same kinds of emotional responses that we do in their way. But that story just mirrored stories I've heard from adults. And we're so afraid. And it was insulting and incredibly painful when their child who had died recently was it was like they didn't even exist.
Which again, though, brings up that point about if that's how they were treated in grief as a child, that's what they learned about it as an adult, and then they behave that way, and it just perpetuates that whole issue. And you're right, Red, it's so hard.
And what a gift we can offer people when we say the name and we say, I'm thinking about so and so this holiday season, and just honoring that person and acknowledging that relationship.
It is a gift.
So powerful. It is a gift.
And we need gifts at holidays. So
yes.
Maybe we should think of that.
And like, how many times have we said this? People say, I was afraid that I would make them sad.
Right.
And there's nothing you can say that can make them any sadder. Like,
it's true. Isn't it?
The sadness is already there.
It's there.
Maybe it surfaced in that moment when you said that, but you didn't create that sadness.
You gave them a gift.
You gave them
to be able to express it. Yeah.
Reminds me of the magical thinking. Yeah. I caused the death because I didn't eat my apple. Same thing. So again, for me, what I'm hearing from this is inclusion. If we're families, if we're a family unit and we're collective, then we all have our place in the family, and we all have that place to be included.
Yeah, I'm thinking, like, let's give kids the message that we can handle this, right? That we can make space for hard moments, for big emotions, for that we can move through this. And we really want to just, because as we've been saying, it also sets them up for how they will move through other challenging life experiences. Mm-hmm. Any final thoughts from you, David?
Just to say thank you, Sheila, and I'm so, as Julie mentioned, I'm so thankful that we have this resource in our community, and I hope that. Because I know that parents really struggle with what to do, and they're afraid of doing the wrong thing.
Yeah.
And I just hope that if people are listening and find themselves in that situation, they can find the courage to face this, knowing, as you say, we can deal with this. So thank you.
My pleasure.
Sheila, on that final note, any final thoughts or a story you'd like to share, or even a story that has impacted you I know I'm putting you on the spot.
She does that.
I should have been prepared. I think just, again, offering that invitation to kids to share what their needs are, what their questions are. The example that Red shared with the father who was talking to 2 kids, often kids know things are changing, know something's different with their family. So the number of times that parents sit their kids down to say there's this diagnosis or somebody is dying, and they're like, well, we know something's been going on. And it isn't such a surprise to the kids. So just invite them to participate in some of the conversations and don't feel like you have to have all the answers.
And just as a last note to come off of that point, sometimes kids will make things up in their heads that are more scary,
Much more scary.
and more dangerous and monstrous than the reality might be. Mm-hmm. And so by not including them and not inviting them, we leave them to their own devices and their own imaginations to fill in the blanks.
Yeah.
And quite often, we often fill in the blanks with things that are far worse than maybe the reality that we have in front of us is. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So thank you for being here with us. And as David said, thank you for the work that you do for children and families in our community.
Oh, I'm lucky to be able to do it.
Yeah. Thanks, Sheila.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening to What Now? On the Threshold of Life, Death, and Grief. What Now is produced in partnership with Hospice Peterborough. Music by Paradise Garage and technical support provided by Sean Heichert. What Now is recorded at Thin Space Studio. You can find more episodes of What Now for free on major podcast platforms, including Spotify, CastBox, Apple Podcasts, and Overcast. If you want to support us, please follow and leave a 5-star review wherever you get your podcasts. And tell your friends. It does make a difference.